You need a theory of change.
It gets people involved in politics.
Has anyone had any problems with
How are you going to bring in?
There's a discussion starting on Twitter about the value of social media in Egypt, comparing the 2005 efforts to depose Mubarak and the 2011 efforts to depose him. And so the argument was that the people should have been more discontent in 2005 than they should have had justification being 2011, but maybe did social media make the difference? And there's also a lot of discussion about metrics and the role that metrics have. Questions raised such as, metrics have a role, how do we know our passion is achieving change without these? And another one also particularly directed at Amnesty, but this I think someone coming from within the room. How does Amnesty validate the news coming via Twitter from the Middle East and North African region? What happens if these tweets are not true?
Eric, would you just like to kick off with what's the difference then between 2005 and 2011? Why didn't Mubarak go in 2005?
I have no idea.
Okay. Does anyone else on the panel? That was not what I was expecting here.
Can I
Yeah.
in here? Because the point of my talk was that a bit like people are still arguing about what caused the Great Depression, 80 years ago, there are just some phenomena that are so staggeringly complicated that the only way you even approximate a reasonably good answer is by, to be blunt, working on looking at all the evidence for years and years and years and years and years and years, and trying to separate yourself away and just shut yourself away from the people who just have an agenda which is, I want to sell a book saying the internet's shit and doesn't mean anything, versus I want to sell a book saying the internet's brilliant and does loads of things, and keep away from that debate. And that's going to take, it's going to take academics 50 years arguing about what happened to cause the revolution right now in Egypt. I think that, as many people today said, that's not really it's a profoundly interesting social question. It's totally inappropriate to try and have that in this context. It's not useful because you just end up swapping anecdotes. Interesting anecdotes.
Which kind of says no one else can comment. But does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, can I speculate?
Yeah, speculate away, even though Tom's not going to like it.
I know, there's a friend of mine who's a Lebanese professor who says it's all because Bush invaded Iraq, that sent a social virus going around the region. Took a while. A lot of people died. I'm not sure I'm convinced by that one. And I think it's something to do with persistent organising and people trying things out and building and building and building. I think it's something to do with Mubarak just getting older and older and making some missteps and holding open the possibility that his son might succeed him, and it just got a bit too much. I think it has a lot to do with the combination of economic crisis and chance. And this story of the guy in Tunisia, the fruit seller, the educated fruit seller, who set himself on fire, there was a chain of events there, which I don't think anybody could have predicted that it would happen this year rather than last year or in 3 years' time. But it was hooking off a bunch of pre-existing factors, so there was a fertile environment for this change. And that story just somehow led to a chain of events which gave Arabs right across the region a sense that actually they could change something. And the defining experience of the Arab street was one of pessimism and disillusionment and it's always somebody else, the CIA, or it's always somebody else is making change happen in the world, is making history move. And suddenly they found that Arabs were making change and making history move. And that was an extraordinary social virus, and it's still running.
So it's that theme of social virus again. And when it comes to situations like Libya and Egypt, this question about verification and Amnesty's role, I mean, how do you verify some of these stories?
Well, we certainly don't take any of our information off Twitter, so just to be clear on that, we do have researchers on the ground. All of our research is from primary research, but we do also work with NGOs on the ground as well. So we had our researchers in Egypt and currently also in Libya and various other places throughout the region. And they are using social media as well, and they are tweeting too. And we did have, when we had our researchers in Egypt arrested, along with a lot of other human rights activists as well, were able to mobilise social media in order to have an e-action for their release. And they were released, luckily within a day, again, because they were Western activists. Obviously, the Egyptian activists stayed in a lot longer. So, yes, it does have to be primary research. I think it still is helpful to get a bit of more information about what's going on the ground, so you know where to target as well. So if you're getting a lot of information back, you can see patterns emerging, and you can see what's happening on the ground, so that we can actually get our researchers in there to verify it on the ground. But that's how we do it. It isn't something that we're just taking the information from Twitter. We are going to verifiable sources.
Thank you. And again, on that volume thing, we've seen a lot of volume of tweets around Libya and Egypt, which kind of takes us into this whole metrics thing. Is volume everything? Was the difference, with Libya and Egypt? Maybe it was volume. You mentioned 500,000 people got involved in the Save Our Forests campaign. And do you think it was the volume, it was the metrics that made it? Or what was that sort of tipping point? Going back to that question really about, is it about the metrics or is it about something else?
I think it was a combination of all those things, and that's the point. Some of the petition was definitely significant, both in itself as a way into the campaign for 500,000 people, but then also as something that became reported in the media, was referred to in the parliamentary debates, was a signifier of the strength of opposition. But so too, 38 Degrees members then clubbed together to pay for opinion polling, which found that 84% of the public were against this, which also became referred to and was also significant, as were the emails to MPs demonstrating that their own voters were watching them on this issue and were going to hold them account for how they voted on it, as was the Archbishop of Canterbury writing a letter, as was the point at which Friends of the Earth started getting involved in the issue, or the National Trust. And I don't think it's necessarily that fertile to try and disaggregate this. The point was that they all worked together, and that the petition was very important early on as offering social proof, which I think is a very important concept in networked organising. It proved to people they weren't alone, and that other people felt like them. That drew more people in. I don't know if the Archbishop of Canterbury felt motivated to add his name to a letter to the Telegraph or not, because he saw the petition out there, but I'm sure it didn't do any harm. And it's that kind the internet and digital tools enable that kind of snowballing to happen. In terms of metrics, I don't think I'm interested in click rates or open rates, because I've kind of absorbed the ideology of consumerism. I see it. I come at it as a community organiser whose background is in offline activism, and the way I imagine our interaction with the 38 Degrees community is like there's this kind of giant community hall, but we're doing the kind of stuff that community organisers have been done since Sol Alinsky wrote about it in the 60s, since the Chartists were probably doing it as well. But we're trying to involve a lot of people in decisions about how we campaign. That there's a role for leaders, but that it's a distributed leadership where ideas can come from anywhere, and where the rest of the room also has a say. So what you're talking about when you look at metrics, for me, is the kind of digital equivalent of body language. We're throwing out this suggestion. Do people like it? Do they not? And also, so that's the body language stuff. What's the level of activity around this? But then also the show of hands stuff. Are they clicking yes or no? Are they telling us what to do? And I don't think that's something that kind of can ever substitute for leadership or for passion or for imagination, but it involves everyone in the 38 Degrees community or the Avaz community or whatever in those decisions, rather than it just being me and Johnny and Hannah in the office. And I think that's a really exciting and positive thing, and it's basically allowing old-fashioned community organising to happen on a bigger scale, which, if we're going to catch up with governments and big business, scaling community organising is a really important thing.
So Sam, it's about old-fashioned community activism. And metrics, you've been very critical, and I can't sort of just sweep that under the carpet. So, what's your response there to this being traditional? Is that I want to quote it correctly? Old-fashioned, traditional community activism.
I think it's that meets the internet. Yeah.
Meets the internet.
Just to remark, was the forests just an email? This is the number. You weren't sending emails, or were you? I can't remember what you were doing.
We did all kinds of things. Okay. There was a petition. There were individual voters writing to their individual MPs. Okay. There was donations. There were organising rallies to which MPs were invited to attend, okay, etc.
Yeah. I think the forest campaign was vastly successful, and congratulations to everyone involved on that. And success makes it easy to go, look, everything was good. And I could have replaced the example with forests, I didn't, because I went for something where it was slightly clearer. I think the best way of looking at what I was going for is not necessarily activism, which I agree with pretty much all of it. I agree with community activism is good, community engagement is good. But you sent out the email saying afterwards that we've won. And this is 38 Degrees did this and it worked, 38 Degrees did that and it worked. And you got a little bit of criticism afterwards for not mentioning any other organisation at all in the email. And
we linked to 4, actually.
Then we sort of called you on it because I do things like that. And I got a non-apology, it was late at night, sorry. And I think that's that email could have gone out was kind of what I think some of the problems are. You apologised on the ECF list, and some people on Twitter did point out that you've done exactly the same thing again tonight, but that wasn't my point. Everyone in this room, including you, say it's possible to have a good activism campaign online. Were you campaigning for them? True. I agree with it. My point is that for some of your campaigns, you don't, and that is a problem. And I think Forests is one of the very best campaigns we've seen. It's the others that I'm concerned about.
So it's more of the forest, less of the other stuff. I'm going to just hold there, because I think there's a whole room of people eager just to kind of get their pennies worth in. So who'd like to kick us off? Immediate hand. I think it was like jointly, but we've got the man in the blue t-shirt followed by the lady in the pinky t-shirt, pinky shirt.
My name's Mike Harris. I'm involved with Indie Media. I liked what Eric said a lot. I thought that was a really good piece. And when we were talking about Tahrir Square, and I thought that it's not to do with the technology, it's to do with the sort of political situation, the social desperation in Egypt, and that's what caused the political change there, or the action that was there. But what I think it is doing, what I think social media is doing, is it's forcing the mainstream media to actually take notice and cover events. And I think that this is the main point, that the mainstream media can no longer ignore coverage of political actions when people are getting the information from direct social media sources. So I think that's what it's doing. It's forcing them and drawing them to do it. Because a few years ago, and being from Indie Media, I know this a lot, is that there'd be a huge protest and there'd be all these campaigns. And the mainstream media there wouldn't be anything. No one would know anything. There was a demo in London, 1.5 million people against the Iraq war. The coverage was pathetic. No wonder it didn't have any effect. And I think that that's what the mainstream media is achieving. So it's a kind of a statement rather than a question.
That's right. Statements are fine, you see. We can move on to the person with the pink shirt. So that was the role of social media is filling in an information gap that wasn't there before and making sure that people are sort of informed.
My name is Alafia, and I actually work at Amnesty International at the Secretariat. A colleague of mine recently came up to me and she said that, I signed one of Awaz's web petitions. It was something about the no-fly zone. And it bothered me because I'm not using that as an example to say that therefore digital activism is, doesn't work, because I think it does work. But what bothered me about that is that there are real consequences to people not reading their emails but signing on to things that have consequences for people in other parts of the world. So I think, firstly, if Avaz is such a large organization with 7 million supporters, if you were to get it wrong, there are consequences, which makes you disproportionately powerful, which is always uncomfortable. And second, I think we should reflect, on the fact that there are potentially consequences for democracy, although we don't always operate in a climate of perfect information.
Paul?
Well, I think one of the positive things about the fact that Avaz has grown and 38 Degrees has grown is that they are now institutions, and institutions need to be held accountable, and they are held accountable pretty effectively by their members. I'm not at Avaz anymore, but when I was there, I would get thousands and thousands of emails, and very often get into some debate with people. And from those conversations, generally people read the whole email. There's always an anecdote because you're dealing with very large numbers. Like, I think over 1 million people took actions on the recent Libya campaign that Avaz did. So there's always going to be a few people there who didn't read their email properly. But actually, that campaign would not have been successful if most people hadn't supported it. They polled the membership. They had about 84% support for it across the membership, and I think less than 10% expressing any opposition or concern. And if I know them, they had some very serious conversations about whether this was or wasn't the right thing to do, and about the consequences of inaction versus the consequences of action. And if you look at the details of that campaign, then actually the policy was really strong, and there were a set of barriers in terms of, if people overreach, then we're going to flip around and campaign against it. I think at the end of the day, I'm not going to take a position on this stage about that campaign, but I think it was a serious process, entered into seriously, pursued seriously, and it would be a terrible shame if these new institutions became as paralysed as many of our old institutions.
On that note, I was going to say, and an old institution sitting next to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is a concern. I mean, a lot of our activism, particularly when it is global, has to be linked to people on the ground. And those organisations who don't necessarily have those links to the ground, where they're getting information from and how they're making those kind of policy decisions, starts getting very, very difficult. I mean, it's kind of one thing having a big petition on trees in England. It's quite easy to find out that kind of information. But when you are talking about, as you say, something which is about basically military intervention in another country, it really does need to be very clued into having actually people there.
And is that as well where the trade union movement really kind of comes into play as well?
Well, it's an interesting point. Amnesty prides itself on being 100% accurate all the time on everything. We'll never issue a statement that its research team hasn't actually looked at, and has actually called us out at least once when we were asked to do a campaign on behalf of a Kurdish teacher who was going to be executed the following day. And I got hauled into Amnesty and told he's not actually going to be executed at all. And it was quite an embarrassing moment for us. We were relying on information from an institution as large as Amnesty that had gotten it wrong. So I'm proud of it. Amnesty doesn't always get it right also. I mean, nobody does. One of the points is they have hundreds of researchers who are fluent in the local languages, and they still get things wrong from time to time. We're human. So we can do a campaign and get a fact or two wrong, even get the point of the campaign wrong. We can correct ourselves also. So I wouldn't get crazy about this. I mean, most of us are good people working for good causes. We haven't actually caused deaths that I know of by our online campaigns so far. We've, in fact, probably saved some lives. We know we have. So I wouldn't get too carried away by this. We will make mistakes. We'll get some things wrong from time to time. We're the best researchers in the world. It still happens.
Okay, our next comment, statement, conversation, point to whoever's made something already. Gentleman in the middle with the khaki, yeah.
My name's Ian, I'm from Oxfam. A lot of the discussion's been about how digital complements offline and how the nature of things hasn't really changed. But then to get to the heart of that, I just wondered if people haven't really discussed then what the implications are for the nature of networks and how organisations network with each other, how they network with their members. And I just want to know if people could go a little bit more in depth on that. And my second point was, throughout the sort of the Arab uprisings and in a lot of other countries, a high percentage of populations are very young and they've always had the internet. And I just wondered what people might think about how that makes a difference for how they interact with these tools compared to people who weren't born when the internet.
So there were two people who mentioned about sort of different forms of activism coalescing, and NGOs need to catch up with 24-hour news cycles. So that was, first of all, David, and actually Paul then was also talking about networked kind of organisations. David, do you want to just answer that maybe query?
I think that's a really important question, and one I would love to be spending a lot more time on. I think it's one of the interesting perspectives that I get as someone involved with 38 Degrees is obviously we work within different sections of kind of civil society, the environmental NGOs, the development NGOs, the trade unions, etc. And you kind of see where some are ahead and some are behind in terms of the way they collaborate and the way they share information. I think there is a challenge around speed and collaboration. Speed is often a challenge, and collaboration is often a challenge, and speedy collaboration is often a hell of a challenge. And I think there's a really good recent example of where in the UK context that really cost us dear. The negotiation of the coalition agreement, despite Sam's best efforts, still was a pretty fast process, and a process where essentially it's now the governing document of that we're working with as campaigners seeking to influence UK government policy over the next few years. And in that 2 weeks, I'm sure I wasn't the only one that was scrabbling around, ringing up different people saying, what do we need to be pushing for, what's going on? And existing interagency clearinghouses had their regular monthly meetings sometime at the beginning of June and just couldn't keep up. And I think that is a challenge to us, and I think it's a challenge that has got greater with 24-hour news cycles. I think, though, it's also become more urgent just simply because it doesn't have to be like that anymore. It is possible to communicate more quickly. If the media and corporations and government can do it, so can we. I don't think I have all the answers to that, but I think it should be a question that we're asking a lot more. And we should be debating here rather than whether or not Slacktivism is evil or whatever.
As a fellow Oxfam, from Oxfam to Oxfam, what is the Oxfam view?
This is obviously because I'm such a bad boss that Ian can't come and talk to me. I'll answer the second question first. So I think there is it's partly what I meant when I said there's some very interesting stuff afoot, and not all of it is necessarily unambiguously good. I think that there is great promise and great danger in the fact that there is a rising generation of young people, particularly in some of the most fragile states in the world. If you look at the demographics, places like Pakistan and Nigeria, places where you can get a mobile phone, but you can't necessarily get a steady job or many of the other things that you would want to have a good life. And I think that the dynamics of those kinds of populations, on the one hand, there's great energy there that could, become a cleansing wave that washes across illegitimate governments and other. I'm going to get in trouble saying this sort of thing, and other power centres. But on the other hand, we have an age of the death of deference and of a kind of culture of skepticism, and people, could just end up focusing on their own interests and fragment. And I think it depends what people do with it, basically. So I think the next 10 years or so are critically important in terms of the response to this demographic challenge and opportunity, but also the wider challenges which we face. And the answer is the answer to your first question, which is I see no alternative but for many of our institutions in civil society as well as in government and markets and business part of the world to become more transparent, more translucent, more responsive to people's real needs, people's real desires. I've thought that for a decade. I've been plugging away in the trenches of it. I'm spending some time in a bigger institution now, seeing what can be done about it. They're the right questions. I wish I had a glib answer for them.
Do you want a quick comeback at all whilst in public with your boss? Or
I thought he had a great answer by the way.
You can have a raise.
Okay, the gentleman in the check shirt, and then there's someone behind as well.
Coming to back to this idea of online meme warfare that was raised earlier, particularly with respect to the Tea Party. I'm wondering what the panel, and in fact anyone here, thinks of the recent issues that George Monbiot has been raising around persona management and essentially the corruption of online debate, and also then wondering what can be done about it, and is this really the emerging threat that he makes it out to be?
So I'm going to get Tom, but also I want the audience to kind of think, could you indicate if you'd like to answer that question if you were in the audience? There's someone over there. Okay, Tom.
I'm glad that somebody's basically asked a question, which is what's next, because Sam kind of hinted at it and it's been mentioned in passing, because back in 2006 I came here. I met some people, some Americans. They took me to the Move On retreat before the midterm elections. It was all kind of private thing for the Democrats. They were already massive. They were about to become even more massive. And they basically explained, like kind of sitting on top of a mountain listening to the sage, how simple the Move On model is and how incredibly, amazingly effective it is. And I then came back and gave about 50 speeches at conferences where I said, someone has to come here and they will basically destroy or eat the lunch of centre-left kind of NGOs that already exist. And I'm so glad 38 Degrees finally came along and finally did it, because it was obvious for a couple of years before 38 Degrees set up that someone was going to do it. Avaz did it in the international space. Get Up did it in Australia.
I'm not sure we're destroying or eating lunches, though.
There will be progressive NGOs that will be smaller because you get bigger, and that just seems almost inevitable to me, and not necessarily something to lament. One weird thing that happened though here was that during that period of time when the government was left wing, was that the right wing here didn't get it. They were obsessed by blogs, right? Having sat at this kind of feet of the gurus, it was incredibly obvious to me that all they had to do was basically take the Move On playbook, dust it off, reproduce the same thing, and they'd have 3 million people on their mailing list who could got to do anything. But they were so obsessed by blogs as a kind of like, this is what the right-wing internet means, that they didn't do it. Now the secret's out. There's been some big elections in Britain and America. The government in both countries has switched sides a couple of times. Now we're into an arena where everybody knows what it's like. Everybody knows what it takes. And the Tea Party is basically the kind of part of the manifestation of that, as are other right-wing American groups. Within Britain, 38 Degrees is that manifestation. So we're going to see a fascinating arms race where both sides can do it just as well. And the one-off historical advantage where only the Move On people knew the magic source in the book, or only the 38 Degrees people knew the special source, that's going to, within 5 years, that will look like ancient history. And so the intriguing thing that happens, what happens when there's 2 or 3 massive, incredibly well conversion track campaign groups, possibly none of which existed before about 2008, that become the big dominant campaign groups on the left and the right in most developed countries? This is a really fascinating question. It relates to what you're saying about the legitimacy in the space, because I know 3 startups in America that are all about the fact that the politicians there just literally can't cope with the mail anymore, and it's about replacing that mail interface, just saying we politicians need you to use some other thing that means we can sort of tell who you are in some way, because we're just at this point taking all the mail and throwing it away, or we're looking at the little number at the top, we're weighing it up against a lot of other enormous numbers that reflect how big the emails are, and we're basically, and politics carries on as normal. It's just instead of the opinion poll numbers we used 5 years ago, we now have these numbers that represent 10 million emails in our boxes that we haven't read. these startups are coming into the space to say, maybe we just shouldn't be using email for that. Maybe if it's all about the like 10 million people think this, 6 million people think that, maybe actually we can bypass that process, and maybe also we can have more credibility that 3 million of those 6 million aren't some teenager with a really good mailing script. And so on the Monbiot point, I think that kind of, will there be a space for kind of legitimacy? I think what we're going to see is as everyone gets better and better and better at being 38 degrees, the premium for being 38 degrees will relatively go down, and there will become special new startups and NGOs that exist only to be the thing that isn't like that. They're not here yet. We're only seeing the beginnings of that. But I think a world in which there are 10 38 degrees on each side of the political spectrum is one in which, as Mr. Monbiot suggests, you have to carve out special spaces where there's a much higher level of verification about who people are or whether they're speaking the truth, because otherwise the noise is just going to get so great that nothing's going to mean anything at all.
I'm going to go to the gentleman there, and then I'll come back to you both.
The assumption is that social media is distributing power, but in a sense, it's also meant a massive concentration of power in a few very big corporate hands. You've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got Google. These are largely very unregulated corporations, and increasingly you're seeing them coordinate their activities, particularly beyond America's borders, with the US State Department. We've seen that with Google in China, we've seen that in Iran. That surely has a very serious implication for the capacity of these channels for social change. And I think we all should really reflect on that. If we're putting our eggs in these particular baskets, there's got to be an impact there.
Two points. First of all, you brought up the Tea Party. And when I hear the word activists used, just in the trade union movement, we don't actually talk about it. It's not a word that's thrown around. So I come to a room full of people and we're all campaigners and activists, but are we left-wing activists or right-wing activists? You know, Micah's first speech was about revolution. I was thinking, what on earth is he talking about? It may be a generational thing. I mean, I define myself as a person of the left. I would actually go so far as to say I'm a socialist. Some of you may completely disagree and be on the right. I don't even know what these terms mean. I'm assuming mostly, broadly speaking, most of us are progressive and on the left here. But there's no guarantee of that. And there's nothing in this technology that specifically works better for us than for right-wingers. Nothing. And American politics proves it, because the biggest grassroots movements in America predate the Tea Party by a lot. For example, the anti-abortion activists did grassroots organizing on an incredible scale, quite successfully for many years, as do those who oppose gun control. I mean, these are gigantic grassroots movements that can use these technologies as well as we can, if not better. So the technology itself isn't biased to helping the good guys. The technology is absolutely can help the bad guys and will help them equally. The other point I want to make, actually nobody brought up surprisingly, is the technology makes us more vulnerable in ways we were never vulnerable before. An example would be when we do a campaign, targeting a company, and we send them 5,000 messages from ordinary trade unionists who not necessarily don't know all the facts, they know what we've told them. And the company immediately writes back to all 5,000 of them and sends them a 5-page letter explaining the union is lying. And these are the real facts about our company. We're the good guys. And then we get a barrage of letters from people saying, what are the facts? I'm now confused. And unions, being unions, take 3 weeks to respond. Right? So this is, and when we're giving our mailing lists to our opponents the minute we do that, particularly when you target a company, you target Nestle or whatever, you've sent them 10,000 of your email addresses, which they can use as many times as they want to put their message across. And that's a vulnerability we never had in the past. And it's a significant vulnerability.
David, if 38 Degrees members decided to liberate gun control in the UK, and enough of them did, what would you do?
Steward leadership.
Steward leadership, yes. The starting point for that is it's just not that kind of community. And you know, there was a phase in the very early days of 38 Degrees when we had a vision of what kind of people is it that we want to bring together. And we didn't have a membership, so we couldn't be member driven, but we knew that there were a set of values that we wanted to rally people around, of equality and democracy and human rights and international solidarity, these kind of things, which meant that the community that has then grown up over that and now drives the agenda would not suddenly start being racist or kind of a crazy right-wing community. It just wouldn't. What would we do in that situation? It would be a fundamental kind of block on the kind of, and crisis for the kind of organisation we are, because we are both committed to being member-driven and to a set of values. I think the point that those values have always been up front means that in practice it's not a crisis I would anticipate us having. And it's a question that, like, it's one of those things that, like, people can throw it at us in theory what would happen. It's just if you're as intimate with the kind of people that are 38 Degrees members as the small staff team are, if you're listening to them all the time, if you're just a member of our Facebook group, you'll see that that's just not how we as a community see ourselves. I did want to really quickly come back on this point, this idea that 38 Degrees is kind of eating the rest of the left's lunch. Two really important facts. I want to work with you people, so I don't want you to leave thinking that. 2/3 of 38 Degrees members were not engaged before they got engaged in 38 Degrees. They'd not written to their MP before. They weren't part of an existing NGO. And most of those that were engaged in other organisations were engaged in multiple organisations anyway. Nobody owns these people, and this isn't a zero-sum game. And maybe one day when 10, 15 million people are active in progressive campaigning using the internet, then we can have a zero-sum game. But that's, in the meantime, let's just all do what we can to deliver good activism that empowers more people and makes the world a better place. And let's think about what kind of structures and institutions and understanding we need to reach to work together better with that. I know that some people have comments about how 38 Degrees talks about working with other people. A challenge that we grapple with is we are at one and the same time trying to tell a story to our members of the impact they had because of that second kind of impact that we're obsessed with, of making, reiterating back to people what we did together to have an impact, but at the same time leaving space to talk about the other players. The infamous email we sent out after Forest was a press release that went out in the middle of the night. The email that went out to 38 Degrees the next morning had links to 5 different organisations in it, in the body and in the links. I think I've got that number wrong. Somebody was probably spotted it was 4 or 6. But the idea that the main communication we put out didn't mention other players is just not fair. And I think if we're having that conversation, it's really helpful if the place we start from is the facts, and I'm sure we didn't get it all right, but we did that, talking about a press release, but we couldn't liaise with other organisations to get their permission on. This is fair.
Accountability.
Okay.
Not because it's not interesting, it's finally getting going. So I'm going to ask Naomi, then Sam, and do either of you have final words? Quick words, if they are. Okay. So, Naomi.
I think a really good point about corporations who are involved in this too. So in Egypt, it was very quickly Mubarak asked Vodafone to cut down its service, for example, and its coverage. So that is something that's gone. We've already had, countless examples of, for example, Yahoo handing over user information to authorities. So corporations really have a role in this, and the more that people are using the internet and social media, they have to be held to account. So they also have to respect human rights as well as, because they do have as much power as governments now do in a lot of these. And just quickly it's not all just about numbers as well. It's not just about getting 1 million people to sign a petition. Sometimes, we're working on a lot of issues that we actually keep quiet because, in fact, if you go and do a lot of public campaigning on things such as asylum seekers or Roma and Gypsy travellers, you're not going to get a huge amount of support for what you're doing. And so actually the kind of activism involved is about solidarity with individuals, it's about visiting people in detention centres, and it's about direct lobbying that we do. So again, it's not just about getting a huge number. There's a whole load of other types of activism which are as important, and sometimes we do want to keep some of the things that we do out of the news as well.
Thank you. Sam, you get the final panel kind of thing. Say.
And the one thing that when we talk about amnesty tends to get thought of if you're not involved in this is sort of letter writing campaigns. And the point of those is often not the letter but the thud in whichever desk the stack of letters get delivered to. Everyone is unique, everyone is polite, and everyone is carefully written by an individual, and absolutely none of them are spam. And they don't get counted, they often don't even get read. The point is that they get sent and there is something other than the number. And I think that's what Mika was trying to get at when he started this off this evening.
Thank you very much.